First history on the night shift. The watchman of the abandoned factory. When I got the call about the job, I didn't ask too many questions. I was broke, bills were piling up, and a security gig sounded easy enough. The place? An old factory on the outskirts of town, long abandoned after a fire. I'd heard rumors about the place like everyone in town had, but I wasn't the superstitious type. Ghost stories never paid anyone's rent. The first night I arrived, the air was thick with neglect. The factory sat like a dead giant, its windows shattered, steel beams rusting under the weight of forgotten years. My job was simple. Walk the grounds every hour, check the perimeter, and report any suspicious activity. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. The first few hours passed in silence, save for the crunch of my boots on broken glass and debris. Inside, the factory felt like a tomb, cold and hollow. The smell of burnt metal still lingered, though the fire had been over a decade ago. They never rebuilt it after that night, just left it to rot. Around midnight, that's when I first heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the cavernous halls. I stopped dead, listening. At first, I thought it was just the sound of my own steps bouncing off the walls, but then they came again, this time from somewhere behind me. I whipped around, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing, just the same empty corridors lined with rusted machinery and blackened walls. I forced myself to breathe, laughing it off. You're hearing things, Carlos. It's just the wind, or rats. But the longer I stayed, the more I noticed things. Shadows that shouldn't be there. Movement in my peripheral vision that vanished the second I turned my head. Doors creaking open when I knew I had just shut them. It was subtle at first, almost like the place was playing tricks on me. But soon it became impossible to ignore. By the third night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There were old reports about this place. Stories I'd heard growing up, but never cared to believe. Workers had gone missing before the fire, vanishing without a trace. Some said they got trapped when the blaze broke out. Others claimed they fled, but their bodies were never found. Then there were the whispers about something else. Something in the walls, lurking in the dark corners of the factory long before the fire. That night, as I made my rounds, I found an old office on the far side of the building. It was the one part of the factory that hadn't been completely destroyed by the fire. I hadn't noticed it on my earlier shifts. Must have missed it in the maze of corridors. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I stepped inside, my flashlight illuminating piles of burnt papers, overturned filing cabinets, and a thick layer of dust coating everything. But what caught my eye was the desk in the center of the room. On it was an old ledger, its pages yellowed with age. I flipped it open, curiosity getting the better of me. The names listed were all workers from the factory, shift records, hours logged. And then, towards the back, I found something strange. Several names had been crossed out, thick lines drawn through them. Next to each name was a single word, missing. Suddenly, I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time, heavier. They weren't trying to hide anymore. I backed out of the office, my heart racing, and slammed the door shut. The factory felt different now, like it was awake. The footsteps continued, echoing through the empty halls, but now they weren't alone. There was something else, something heavier, like the dragging of metal. I sprinted down the hallway, my flashlight flickering as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Ahead of me, the air seemed to shift, thickening with a presence I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. My breath came in ragged gasps, the hair on my arms standing on end. I made it to the main floor of the factory and stopped. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the room, standing between the burnt-out husks of two massive machines, was a figure. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its body was twisted, charred, like it had been caught in the fire, but never truly died. My flashlight flickered again and went out completely. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get as far away from that thing as possible. The footsteps behind me were faster now, closing in, and that dragging sound, the screech of metal on concrete, it was following me. I didn't stop until I reached the front gate, nearly tripping over myself as I fumbled with the lock. The cold night air hit my face as I stumbled outside, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I collapsed against the fence, gasping for breath, my eyes locked on the factory. The shadows inside still moved, shifting and twisting, as if the factory itself was alive. I quit the next morning, didn't even bother to collect my last paycheck. Whatever was in that place, whatever walked those halls, it wasn't human. And it sure as hell wasn't gonna stop just because I left. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The sound of footsteps echoing through my mind, dragging metal and all. And I can't help but wonder how many watchmen had been hired before me, and how many more would follow. Because I'm sure of one thing, whatever's in that factory is still waiting. Second story on the night shift, the gas station refuel. I'd been working the night shift at the old gas station for about 6 months when I first noticed it. You know, the kind of place that's so remote even the tumbleweeds don't bother to roll by. It's perched on the side of an empty highway, the kind of road you only take if your GPS hates you. Just truckers passing through in the dead of night, their rigs groaning under the weight of endless miles. For the most part, it's quiet. Too quiet. At first, it was easy money. Sit behind the counter, scroll through my phone, maybe refill the coffee machine a few times if someone came through. But then the weird stuff started. It began with the security cameras. I'd do my usual checks, mostly to break the monotony, and see the figure. Always at the same time, around 3:14 a.m., without fail. Just a shadowy figure standing by pump 3, never moving. The first time I saw it, I figured it was a glitch. Maybe the system was freezing up and showing an old recording. Except it wasn't. Every night, 3:14 a.m., the figure would appear, just standing there, like it was waiting for something. But whenever I'd step outside, pump the gas and take a look around, nothing. Not a damn thing. I tried not to think about it. Shrugged it off as one of those tech malfunctions. I'd seen plenty of those at this crummy job. But as the days went on, it started getting to me. There was something off about how that shadow just hovered, too still for a person, too clear for a shadow. It was a Tuesday when things took a turn. I was alone as usual. No one had passed through for hours, and the highway outside was an empty, winding ribbon under the cold, distant stars. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes darting from my phone to the clock, waiting for the shift to end. 3:14 a.m. ticked over. I glanced at the camera feed, half expecting to see it there again. Sure enough, the figure stood by pump 3, motionless. I squinted at the monitor. It looked different this time, like it was closer or more defined. The shape was human but wrong. Too tall, too thin. My pulse quickened, and before I could stop myself, I grabbed the flashlight and went out into the night. The wind was sharp, cutting through my jacket as I stepped outside. The pumps stood silently under the flickering lights. Pump 3 was right in front of me, empty, no figure, just the hum of the old neon sign above the station and the distant rustle of trees. I turned to go back inside when the pump clicked on. I froze. The handle lifted from the holster on its own, dangling in midair like someone was holding it. I rushed back inside, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding as I checked the cameras again. The figure was gone. The handle of pump 3 had returned to its place like nothing had happened. The rest of the night was a blur, but I made it through, telling myself it was just a mechanical glitch. That's what I wanted to believe, at least. A couple of nights later, the real trouble started. It was a little after midnight, and the wind had picked up, howling across the empty parking lot. I sat inside the station, staring at the clock, counting the minutes to 3:14. Every night, I dreaded that time, but I couldn't stop myself from watching the monitors, waiting for it to happen again. And then, right on cue, the lights outside flickered. I looked up, and there it was. This time, the figure was closer. It wasn't by Pump 3 anymore. It was right outside the station store. I could see its outline clearly through the glass, tall and looming. I backed away from the counter, heart racing, as the door rattled. The handle turned slowly, creaking as it twisted, but the door didn't open. I didn't wait to find out if it would. I grabbed my phone and dialed the manager, but it went straight to voicemail. The lights flickered again, then went out entirely, leaving the station bathed in darkness except for the faint glow from the emergency exit sign. I fumbled for my flashlight and pointed it at the door. Empty. The figure was gone. That's when I heard it, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from behind me. My blood ran cold. There was no one else in the station. I spun around, sweeping the flashlight across the shelves of chips and candy, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped. Then the gas pumps roared to life outside. All of them. The lights on each pump blinked on, and the handles lifted, each one pouring gas onto the pavement like invisible hands were squeezing the triggers. I ran outside, but the pumps shut off the moment I stepped out. Just silence. The smell of gasoline hung heavy in the air. That's when I saw the truck. It was an old rig, battered and rusted, parked at the far end of the lot. I hadn't heard it pull in. The windows were so dirty I couldn't see inside, but something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this time or in this place. I walked toward it, but the closer I got, the colder the air felt, like stepping into a freezer. My breath fogged up instantly, and a deep sense of dread twisted in my gut. I reached for the door handle, not sure why, just driven by some need to know. As my hand hovered over the rusted metal, a loud creak echoed through the lot. I turned and saw the figure again, standing right at Pump 3, just like every night before. But now I could see its face, or rather what was left of it. Its skin was charred and cracked, like it had been burned beyond recognition. Hollow eye sockets stared back at me, empty and cold. The stench of burnt flesh hit me, thick and suffocating. And then I knew who this was. The truck, the accident, the stories. There had been a fire years ago. A trucker had died, trapped inside his rig after it jackknifed and exploded in flames. They said he'd burned alive on the side of this highway, right where the station now stood. I stumbled back, the figure still watching me, unmoving. The pumps clicked on again, one by one, and the lights flickered violently. The door of the old truck creaked open behind me, and I swear I heard something dragging itself out. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran inside, locked the door, and refused to look at the cameras. The pumps shut off. The lights stopped flickering. But I knew whatever was out there, it wasn't gone. And now, every night, I wait, because I know it'll be back. Just like clockwork, 3:14 a.m. It's only a matter of time before it gets inside. Third story on the night shift. The mysterious passenger on the last ride. I've been driving the night shift for over 10 years now. Most people can't handle it. The darkness, the silence, the strange figures who occasionally wander onto your bus. But for me, it was peaceful. I liked the stillness of the city after hours, the way the streets seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the sun to rise. I thought I had seen everything, that there was nothing left to surprise me. Until that night. It was a Thursday, late November, the kind of cold that wraps around you like a damp blanket. The bus was nearly empty. Just a few regulars I had come to know by their tired eyes and the smell of coffee on their breath. The route was routine. Stop, start, stop, start. I was almost done for the night when I saw him. He was standing alone at a bus stop near the edge of town, where the streetlights barely reached and shadows swallowed the road. Something about him felt off immediately, but I brushed it off. Passenger is a passenger. He stepped onto the bus without a word. No greeting, no nod, just the cold shuffle of his feet as he moved down the aisle. His clothes were old, out of place somehow, like he had stepped out of another time. A faded brown trench coat, a crumpled hat pulled low over his face. He moved to the back of the bus and sat down. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but all I could make out was his outline in the dim light. First, it was nothing. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. He didn't pull the cord for any stops, didn't get off when we reached the terminal. I figured he had fallen asleep or maybe just didn't care where he was going. It wasn't the first time someone had used the bus as a place to escape the cold. But as I made the loop back into the city, something strange happened. I lost sight of him. One moment, I saw him in the mirror, slouched in his seat at the back. The next, he was gone. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to find him in the shadows. The back of the bus was completely empty. I slowed down, pulled over, and stood up, walking the length of the aisle, my boots echoing on the cold floor. Nothing. No one. I shrugged it off. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But when I sat back down and started driving again, there he was, in the mirror, same seat, same position, staring straight ahead. My heart skipped. I wasn't the type to get rattled easily, but something about this, I couldn't explain it. I thought about saying something, asking him where he was headed, but when I opened my mouth, no words came out. I didn't want to hear his voice, didn't want to engage with whatever was sitting in the back of my bus. The rest of the ride was tense, every stop feeling slower, every empty street colder. By the time I pulled into the garage at the end of my shift, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I checked the bus one last time. He was gone. No sign that he had ever been there. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a trick of the light, maybe just some vagrant who knew how to disappear into the city's cracks. But the next night, he was there again. Same stop, same clothes, same silence. This time, I watched him carefully, refusing to take my eyes off the rearview mirror. But halfway through the route, he vanished again. Just gone. No trace. The bus felt colder in his absence, like the air itself had been sucked out. I tried to ignore it. I told no one. But then the messages started. It began with a woman in her 30s. She stepped onto the bus with a nervous look in her eyes, glancing around like she expected something terrible. She sat down near the front and, after a few minutes of silence, leaned forward to talk to me. "Did you see him?" she whispered, barely audible over the hum of the engine. "See who?" Her eyes darted toward the back of the bus. "The man. The one who never gets off." A chill ran through me. I hadn't mentioned the man to anyone. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've seen him before," she continued, her voice trembling. "He was on the bus the night my brother died, 2 days before the accident." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her for details. But when she got off at her stop, I could feel her fear lingering in the air. The following night, another passenger said the same thing. And the night after that, each story was the same. They had seen the man before, always in the days leading up to a fatal accident. A car crash, a factory fire, a freak accident at a construction site. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that he was watching me. I checked the security cameras after my shift, desperate for some kind of explanation. But there was nothing. Each night, the footage was the same. Empty bus stops, empty streets, and yet I knew he had been there. I had seen him with my own eyes. I started to lose sleep, wondering who he was, what he wanted. And then, a week after he first appeared, I got the call. An accident on my route. A bus just like mine veered off the road late at night. The driver didn't make it. The fear settled deep in my chest. I couldn't help but wonder if she had seen him too, if he had been sitting in the back of her bus, silently waiting. Now, every night I dread that final stop. I know he'll be there, watching, waiting. I can feel his presence even before I see him. And I can't help but wonder how long it will be before I'm the one who doesn't make it home. Because I know now, he doesn't leave until it's your turn. Fourth history on the night shift. The last customer at the convenience store. I had heard the stories before, of course. Everyone who worked the night shift at Stan's 24-hour convenience store had. But I never paid much attention. Ghost stories, urban legends, nothing more than a way to pass the long hours after midnight. The kind of thing you laughed about while stocking shelves or sipping stale coffee to stay awake. I started at the store a few months ago, taking over for the regular night shift guy who mysteriously quit without warning. No one really knew why, but they had their theories. Burnout, some said. Couldn't handle the quiet. Others joked he had seen the customer. The customer. That's what they called him, like he was something special. A ghost, or so the story went. He showed up once a month, always at the same time, always bought the same things, and then vanished. People said the cameras never caught him, that the cash register malfunctioned whenever he showed up. I didn't believe any of it. That night, though, I was about to find out how wrong I was. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and the store was dead quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the only sound was the gentle hum of the cooler. I was halfway through my shift, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone behind the counter, waiting for the hours to drag by. That's when the door chimed. First, I barely noticed. Another late-night customer. Probably a trucker or some college kid too wired on caffeine to sleep. But then I looked up. He didn't quite fit the usual profile. He was dressed in outdated clothes, a buttoned-up flannel shirt tucked into worn-out jeans, a heavy jacket hanging loosely on his shoulders. His hair was neatly combed, but his face seemed oddly pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. There was something unsettling about him. He didn't look at me, didn't even seem to register I was there. He just walked through the aisles like he'd been here 1,000 times before, as though he knew exactly where everything was. I watched him from behind the counter, trying not to be obvious. He moved slowly, methodically, picking up items and placing them in a plastic basket. A can of soup, a pack of chewing gum, a pack of cigarettes. Nothing unusual, but the way he moved, it was like he was in his own world, disconnected. When he finally came up to the counter, I gave him my standard half-hearted greeting. "How's it going tonight?" No response. He just stared down at the items in the basket, placing them on the counter one by one. His hands were unnaturally still, deliberate, like every movement had been rehearsed. I scanned the first item. The register beeped, then the screen froze. The digital numbers flickered and glitched, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. The lights above seemed to buzz louder, the hum of the cooler almost deafening now. "Sorry, let me just try that again," I muttered, forcing a smile. But when I tried to scan the next item, the entire system locked up. The register wouldn't respond. I pressed buttons, rebooted it, tried everything, but it stayed frozen, dead. The man didn't say a word, just stood there, waiting. I glanced up at him, and for the first time really looked at his face. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and his skin had a sickly pallor to it, like it didn't belong on his bones. He seemed out of place, out of time. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I remembered the stories then, the ones I had laughed off, about the customer who wasn't supposed to exist, who showed up once a month to buy the same things, and then disappeared into thin air. Forcing a nervous laugh, I said, sorry about the system. It's acting weird tonight." I tried to make light of it, but my hands were shaking. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned his head slightly and looked at me for the first time. His eyes locked with mine, and I felt a deep, suffocating dread rise from my stomach. There was no life behind those eyes. It was like looking into a void. Without thinking, I stammered, I'll try again." As I reached for the keyboard, the lights above flickered. The buzzing sound grew louder, and the temperature in the store seemed to drop by several degrees. I could see my breath now, small clouds of mist escaping with each exhale. The system screen flashed once more, and then a notification popped up. "Error. Customer not found." My blood ran cold. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call my manager, but before I could dial, something made me stop. A thought, or maybe a voice, soft and distant, echoing in my mind. Check the records. Look him up. I had never bothered with the old paper logs we kept in the back, but something pushed me there. Something instinctive. I hurried to the small storage room and pulled out the dusty binder where we recorded old transactions, flipping through the pages until I found the right month. I didn't even know what I was looking for, but then I saw it. The name, Matthew Grant. My heart dropped. The name was familiar, too familiar. Took me a moment to remember why. I grabbed my phone and typed his name into a search engine, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through the results. There it was, a news article from exactly 10 years ago. Matthew Grant had been a regular at Stan's, living just a few blocks away. He had died in a car accident late one night, on the same road that ran past the store. He'd been on his way here to pick up his usual order. Soup, gum, cigarettes. I stared at the article, my mind spinning, trying to piece it together. The man standing in my store had been dead for a decade. When I returned to the counter, the customer was gone. The air was still, the lights back to their usual flicker. I stepped outside, looking into the empty parking lot, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had never been there. But then I noticed something on the counter where his basket had been were the items. The can of soup, the pack of gum, and the cigarettes, sitting there, untouched. I hadn't rung them up, and beside them, a single crumpled dollar bill. That was the last time I saw him. But every month, on the same day, at the same time, the system glitches, the lights flicker, and the temperature drops. I know he's still out there, walking toward the store, repeating that final errand he never got to finish, waiting for someone else to take notice.